They were supposed to be gone for just 2 days. A father trying to mend the pieces of a broken family, and a 10-year-old boy who still believed the woods were magic. But somewhere deep in Oregon's Umpqua forest, beneath a sky tangled in mist and branches, they vanished. No struggle, no sound. Just a cold campfire, 2 sleeping bags untouched, and the overwhelming sense that something ancient had swallowed them whole. 17 years later, someone finds a journal, and it's still being written. They say some forests hum if you stand still long enough. A low, untraceable vibration that isn't sound so much as feeling like breath caught between the trees. In Oregon's Umpqua National Forest, that hum becomes something else entirely. Before we step further into the ring of scorched trees and follow the map that leads where no map should, take a moment to like this video and subscribe to the channel. Your support allows us to keep tracing the paths others abandoned, the names left off official reports, and the echoes buried beneath time's silence. Every click, every share, every subscription keeps these stories alive, keeps the missing from slipping completely into the dark. What seems like a small gesture here is a signal sent out to those still waiting to be found. Thank you for being part of that signal. Locals call it the whisper, a trail of vanishing echoes, lost time, and silence too deep for nature to make. It's the kind of silence that swallows. In the fall of 2008, a man named James Mallory and his 10-year-old son Kyle entered that silence. They weren't tourists. James knew the woods, had grown up nearby, camped those trails as a boy, used to boast about making fire with damp twigs and no matches. That weekend wasn't about adventure. It was about healing. A fractured home, a recent divorce, and a son who had started drawing monsters in the margins of his schoolwork. James thought the wilderness might reset something in both of them. They checked in with a ranger on a Friday afternoon, signed their names on the weather-beaten logbook at a trailhead just past Hemlock Ridge. The ranger remembered them because Kyle had asked if there were wolves. There haven't been wolves in Umpqua for decades, not officially. By Saturday evening, the campsite was quiet. A family hiking back toward the trailhead past a parked blue Tacoma at the base of a clearing. Nothing unusual. The father waved. No response from inside the tent pitched a few yards away. By Sunday afternoon, the truck was still there. No fire, no sounds, no movement. Rangers went in. What they found was eerie in its order. Sleeping bags neatly rolled. Food sealed in bear-safe containers. A journal open to a page that read only, "Fog came early." No signs of a struggle, no blood, no dragging tracks. Just a cold camp and 2 names that would never check out again. The search began that evening. Volunteers, dogs, helicopters with heat sensors. Nothing. Dogs lost their trail almost immediately, as if the air itself had erased their scent. Locals murmured old names for the deeper woods. The place where trees hear, God's blind spot. Some swore it was a sinkhole, a freak accident. Others talked about the lights. Flickers between branches, colors that didn't belong in any spectrum known to science. But after 2 weeks, the official search was called off. No bodies, no gear, no clues. Just an empty forest and a rustle that never seemed tied to the wind. The years went on. The Mallory case faded into another notch in Oregon's long line of wilderness disappearances. Armchair investigators speculated endlessly online. Theories ranged from bears to backwoods cults. But those who knew the forest said little, especially the old-timers. One logger, when asked about the Mallorys, simply said, "That place doesn't take people. It keeps them." In stories like these, what's left behind often says more than what's missing. A truck with a full tank, a tent zipped shut. A boy's sketchbook with a drawing of a hollow tree and 2 stick figures entering it, hand in hand. No signs, no calls, just gone. James Mallory had never considered himself the sentimental type. A contractor by trade and a pragmatist by nature, he believed most problems could be solved with a steady hand and the right tools. But no amount of measuring tape or concrete could fix what was happening to his son. After the divorce, Kyle had grown quiet, not the shy kind of quiet, but the hollow kind. He stopped laughing at the cartoons they used to watch, stopped asking questions at the dinner table, stopped looking James in the eye. And James, for all his stubborn competence, didn't know how to bridge the widening distance. It wasn't anger between them. Not quite. Just absence. A slow fade of connection, like static swallowing a once clear signal. That's why he decided to take him into the woods. It had been years since James had gone back to the Umpqua. As a boy, it had been his refuge, his escape from his own father's short temper and his mother's silences. The forest had rules, but they weren't loud. There, everything made sense. You built a fire, it gave you warmth. You pitched your tent right, it kept you dry. No guesswork, no emotional minefields. Just rhythm, repetition, quiet. He thought maybe, just maybe, if he took Kyle out there, away from the noise of custody hearings and therapy appointments and missed birthdays, something might realign. Something might breathe again. He picked the weekend carefully. Late September, when the crowds had thinned and the air still held a trace of summer warmth, he borrowed a decent tent from a friend, sharpened his old hunting knife, packed trail mix Kyle liked and marshmallows, even though neither of them were big on sweets. He let Kyle choose a book for the ride, something with spaceships and laser guns. Anything to break the silence. Kyle didn't say much when James told him the plan. Just a shrug, then a nod. But James saw something shift in his son's eyes. Not joy, not even curiosity, but possibility. A crack of light in the wall he'd been building. They left early Friday morning. The highway cut through low fog and pine stretches that looked almost painted. James talked more than usual, filling the silence with stories from his boyhood. How he once got lost for 3 hours and swore he'd seen a coyote with 2 tails. How the trees talked to each other if you listened long enough. Kyle sat in the passenger seat, legs too short for the floorboard, hands buried in the sleeves of his hoodie. He didn't laugh, but he listened. By the time they reached the trailhead, the sun had started to burn through the mist. James parked the truck in the same gravel turnout he remembered from years ago. The same old ranger station stood nearby, its logbook warped from weather and time. He signed their names with careful print, then paused. Under expected return, he wrote Sunday, 2 nights. Enough, he thought, to crack something open. As they walked into the forest, Kyle trailed a few steps behind. He wasn't complaining, wasn't glued to a screen. That felt like a victory. James didn't know what would come next. He didn't know if this would fix anything. But as the trees closed around them, and the distant sound of water trickled through the underbrush, he allowed himself to believe that maybe, just maybe, he hadn't already lost his son. Not yet. The campsite was nestled at the edge of a clearing where the trees grew thinner, just enough for weak sunlight to leak through the canopy. A flat patch of moss-covered earth beside a stream that whispered more than it flowed. That's where they set up James and Kyle, 2 days before they vanished. The kind of place that looked untouched, even with tire tracks nearby, as though the forest had a way of erasing intrusions the moment they were made. By all accounts, they made it there without issue. The truck, a faded blue Tacoma, was found parked just off the dirt path. One tire sunk slightly into a soft patch of earth. The driver's door was locked, the passenger door wasn't. Inside the truck, a backpack sat on the floorboard, unzipped but still full. Energy bars, bottled water, an inhaler, a dog-eared copy of the Andromeda strain likely James's. The keys were still in the ignition, turned just far enough to allow the radio to play, though the battery had long since drained by the time rangers arrived. The air inside smelled like pine and old leather, but there was no trace of a struggle, no signs of urgency. The tent remained upright, staked into the loam with precision. Inside, 2 sleeping bags, unrolled, undisturbed. A flashlight still warm to the touch. Nearby, a small fire pit, half-burned logs arranged neatly, as if someone had prepared for nightfall but never stayed to see it come. A cooking pan rested against a rock, soot darkened but clean. There was no blood, no torn fabric, no overturned gear, just stillness, not the peaceful kind. The kind that suggests something ended mid-sentence. The last entry in the ranger station logbook bore their names. No one had signed in or out after them. According to the timestamp, they should have returned by Sunday afternoon. By Monday morning, James's ex-wife had called in a missing persons report. By Tuesday, search crews were combing the trail, their shouts echoing through the trees, unanswered. But the forest didn't care. Locals remember that weekend not for what was seen, but for what was heard. One couple staying in a cabin 3 miles north claimed they heard something just past midnight. A noise they first thought was an animal in pain, but said it ended in something unmistakably human. Another camper, a retired firefighter, described it differently. Like wind caught in a bottle, followed by a series of rhythmic knocks. Like someone rapping their knuckles against tree bark in a slow, deliberate pattern. He told deputies it didn't sound threatening. It sounded curious. No one could place the sounds precisely. The forest has a way of playing tricks with distance, warping echoes until they circle back on themselves. And this forest Umpqua is old. Older than the names carved into trail signs. Older than the roads carved through it. People who live near its edge speak of it like a living thing. Not malevolent, not kind. Just aware. They call it brooding, like something deep beneath the soil is thinking, watching, waiting. Some trees along the trail had markings, though not made by blades or wildlife. Circles, vertical lines. Strange, recursive symbols etched shallow into the bark as if traced by a fingertip. Rangers chalked it up to pranksters. Locals weren't so sure. There's a point, they say, where the forest seems to shift, where sound dies faster and shadows move longer than they should, where compasses start to jitter and footsteps begin to feel like echoes of someone else's. That's the place James and Kyle Mallory walked into, and never walked out of. It began with urgency. Dozens of volunteers assembled at the trailhead, some locals, others from nearby counties, answering the call they'd heard on the radio or through whispered conversations at diners and gas stations. The father and son had already been missing for more than 48 hours, and in the cold logic of wilderness survival, that window was shrinking fast. But hope still burned hot in those first few days. People brought their own gear, wore neon vests, carried laminated maps marked with red circles and narrow paths. The ranger leading the operation spoke with conviction, promising grids would be covered, square by square. "We'll find them," he said. They couldn't have gone far. But the forest, it seemed, had other plans. 2 bloodhounds from Klamath County were brought in on the second day. They sniffed a jacket recovered from the truck, circled the area twice, and then froze. Not with alarm, just confusion. They paced aimlessly, noses twitching toward the tree line, then lay down as if the trail had never existed. Their handlers said it was like chasing a ghost. One of them muttered. They vanished like smoke. Helicopters followed. Equipped with thermal cameras, they swept the area in slow, overlapping arcs. Miles of thick canopy showed no sign of warmth beneath. The aerial team saw nothing but endless crowns of Douglas fir, shifting slowly under the weight of the wind. Even at altitude, there was something uncanny. Every direction looked the same, like the trees themselves were rearranging behind their backs. Over the week that followed, the search became desperate. Crews ventured deeper, sleeping in makeshift camps, marking trees with reflective tape that would often go missing by morning. Radios cut in and out. GPS devices blinked blank, even when fully charged. What should have been mapped and predictable terrain became slippery, uncooperative. Veteran hikers missed landmarks they swore were there the day before. One man, a retired surveyor, walked east for 4 hours only to emerge a few hundred feet from where he started. Volunteers began speaking in low voices around campfires, describing the same thing in different ways. A pressure in the air, a hum beneath the soil, the feeling of being watched. Not the usual wariness of a predator nearby, but something older, less natural. Many used the same phrase without ever having heard it from each other. The forest pushed us back. Some said it subtly, like it was metaphor. Others insisted it was literal, that no matter how far they walked, the trees bent differently. The trails twisted under their feet. At one point, a small group attempted to bushwhack their way across a ravine, only to return 6 hours later, shaken and pale, convinced they'd been followed, though they never saw anything. By the 10th day, official efforts slowed. The press began to trickle in. Cameras caught shots of men exiting the tree line with mud-caked boots and blank stares, too tired to lie. They hadn't found footprints. They hadn't even found broken branches. No drag marks, no signs of animals. It was as if the earth itself had sealed its skin behind them. James and Kyle Mallory weren't missing in the way most people are. They didn't leave a trail. They left absence. A vacuum. An open mouth in the woods that swallowed names and faces, and sent back nothing but stillness. After 2 weeks, the crews dwindled. The command post was packed up. Tape peeled off tree trunks. Helicopters returned to their hangars, and the forest remained, undisturbed, its whisper intact. No one said it out loud, but they all thought it. The woods didn't just keep them. It wanted to be sure they were forgotten. Years passed, and the world moved on, as it always does. News cycles shifted. Other stories took the place of James and Kyle Mallory. Other tragedies, other missing faces. The forest remained the same, quiet, resolute, unmoved. For the outside world, the story faded into a line on a list, another entry in the unsolved files of wilderness disappearances. But for one person, time did not pass. It only deepened. Her name was Meredith. She stopped calling it grieving after the first year. That word, she said, implies an end, a resolution. What she lived with was something colder, more disorienting. Grief assumes you've lost someone. She never got to lose them. She was left suspended, anchored to a moment that never concluded. It's like walking into a room where the lights are off, she once said in an interview. And every time you think you found the switch, it moves again. In the early days, she had believed the system would work. Search and rescue, FBI, local law enforcement. She went to every meeting, collected every map. She circled dates on calendars like they still meant something. Birthdays. Anniversaries. The first snowfall. At night, she sat by the phone long after it stopped ringing. When asked by a reporter how she kept going, she answered simply, "Because someone has to be there when they come back." She never remarried. She never moved. She kept the same landline number, the same house, the same routines. In her kitchen hung a corkboard cluttered with newspaper clippings, ranger reports, and the last school photo of Kyle before he vanished, his smile wide, but unsure, as if he already knew something was coming. Every year, on the weekend they disappeared, Meredith returned to the trailhead. Alone. She would stand where the truck was found, close her eyes, and speak. Not loudly, not pleading. Just speaking, as though across a veil. "I hope it's warm, wherever you are," she once whispered into the trees. "I hope he's still holding your hand." Over time, her voice became part of the forest's own mythology. Hikers claimed they heard a woman's echo long after they'd passed the clearing. Some said she was calling a name, others said it was just breath, caught in the pines. Rangers stopped questioning her presence. They'd just nod when she arrived, leave her to the silence. Meredith didn't believe in ghosts. She didn't speak of hauntings or strange lights. But she did believe the forest remembered. That it held its own kind of memory. If you lose something in the woods, she said once, it doesn't vanish. It gets buried in roots. It becomes part of the soil. She wondered what part of her had become part of it too. The investigators, what few remained, kept their distance after the 5th year. Nothing new had emerged. No remains, no sightings. Even the tips stopped coming in. Her file grew dust. But she never stopped writing letters. To Kyle, to James, she never mailed them. Just folded them carefully and placed them in a cedar box beneath her bed. Hundreds now, stacked and yellowing. Each one an anchor to a fading outline of 2 people who walked into the trees and never returned. And yet, she waited. I talk to the quiet, she once said, because it's all that talks back. It started with stories. Quiet ones, traded in low voices over coffee or murmured in bait shops before dawn. Locals who'd grown up near the Umpqua began speaking of strange things, not as wild tales to impress, but as hesitant admissions. A ranger's wife claimed she heard a child laughing in the fog while walking her dog near Hemlock Ridge. No children were reported missing at the time. The laughter had no direction, no body. Just sound, thin and gliding through the mist like smoke. When she turned, nothing was there. Not even paw prints beside her own. At first, people dismissed it. Forests are loud in unfamiliar ways. Wind moves through trees like breath. Birds mimic cries that don't belong to them, and branches creak like doors in a storm. But then came the others. Campers, hikers, hunters, men and women used to being alone in the wild, reported hearing whispers just before the fog thickened. Not words, but syllables strung together like song. And sometimes, not one voice but 2. One higher, one deeper, one young, one older. A bow hunter swore he saw someone dart between the trees on a moonless night. He described a small figure with pale limbs, moving without a flashlight, barefoot in temperatures that would freeze skin. Another man, a surveyor working on updated trail maps, abandoned the job after his 2nd week. It felt like the forest didn't want to be measured, he told a friend. Like something was erasing my work while I slept. Even the rational began to falter. Rangers who once scoffed at such stories found themselves hesitating at certain bends in the trail. Radios crackled with static in one specific valley, no matter the weather. Trail cams captured blurred images, outlines shaped like people, but elongated, stretched. One shot showed a figure standing too still, too centered in the frame. When blown up, the image degraded, but some swore you could see a small hand clutching an adult's pant leg. They gave the area a name it never officially earned: Mallory Hollow, a ghost term. It didn't appear on any maps, but everyone knew where it was. The trail looped around it like instinct. People avoided camping there, even if they couldn't explain why. And when fog rolled in, which it did often, low and thick as milk, locals said the hollow breathed, that it sighed with memory. Over time, the Mallory case became less a disappearance and more a myth. Not the kind that fades with skepticism, but the kind that lingers because it scratches something ancient. Forums online dissected every detail, connecting it to other vanishings in Oregon, then to disappearances in forests around the country. Threads with thousands of posts speculated on forest frequencies, hidden settlements, interdimensional slips. Most was nonsense, but buried in the noise were patterns too consistent to ignore. Even children began to repeat the stories. A game took root in nearby schools. One child would whisper, "Kyle," into a pine branch, then listen. Sometimes they'd laugh. Sometimes they'd go quiet. The forest, once seen as tranquil, took on a different tone. It became a place people moved around, not through. Locals no longer camped beyond a certain ridge. Some old-timers planted wind chimes in their yards to keep the silence at bay. Not for ghosts, but for echoes. Because that's what the stories became. Not screams, not sightings. Just sounds that didn't belong. And though no one could prove a thing, a sense began to settle in the bones of those who lived close to the trees. That whatever had taken the Mallories had never really left. The man's name was Elias Kearns, a logger with 32 years of dirt beneath his fingernails, and the kind of face that didn't flinch at storms or solitude. He worked contracts all over the Pacific Northwest, but he preferred the quiet ones, the jobs that took him deep into the parts of Oregon most folks had forgotten. That season, he was stationed near Crater Lake, clearing charred timber from a patch of land scorched in the last wildfire. The trees there stood like blackened bones, their limbs twisted and skeletal, the forest floor soft with ash and moss. It was tedious work, the kind that numbed your hands and sharpened your instincts. You learned to spot danger fast, unstable trunks, buried root flare, things waiting to fall. But what caught Elias's attention wasn't danger, it was design. He saw it first on a Thursday morning, just as the sun cut low across the tree line and the frost had started to retreat. A fir trunk, burned black from base to branch, bore something strange along its bark lines. Not natural ones. Not from fire or beetles or the strange ways trees sometimes split after rot. These were shallow, intentional, curving into a pattern too smooth to be accidental. It looked almost like a spiral, but not quite. More like a sequence, an echo of itself, a symbol drawn by something or someone with time and patience. He stepped back, thinking maybe it was graffiti left by kids, but the area had been closed off for months. No tire tracks, no footprints, just his, and the animals, and the trees. Later that day, he saw another, then another, on separate trunks, spaced evenly across a low ridge near the edge of his designated work zone. Each one marked with a variation of the same pattern, curved, recursive, strange. Some symbols were simpler, others more elaborate, as if whoever made them was refining an idea, or evolving it. Elias told himself it was nothing. Maybe it was bark fungus, maybe some hiker had wandered in before the fires and carved their nonsense before the trees burned. But deep down, he knew better. He'd been in woods his whole life. Trees told stories. These weren't old wounds. These were new. On the fourth day, he found the one that stopped him cold. It was smaller, carved lower on the bark, about waist height. The shape was jagged, erratic, like a child's drawing in wood. But above it, etched in a cleaner hand, were 5 letters, Kyle. He didn't know the name at first, just stood there, staring at it, sweat freezing along the back of his neck, even in the morning Sunday. Something about it felt wrong, out of place. Like it had been waiting for someone to find it. He took a picture with his phone, then walked back to camp with a sick feeling he hadn't had in years. That night, he couldn't sleep. The wind shifted through the dead forest like it was whispering things. Not words, just a rhythm, a beat. By morning, he dug out an old article someone had printed and tacked to the corkboard in the ranger station mess. A boy and his father, gone 17 years, no trace. Until maybe now. Elias returned the next day, drawn not by duty, but by something harder to name. The job site could wait. He told himself he was just following up on a curiosity, checking if the symbols extended beyond the ridge. But in truth, it felt less like he was choosing to go back and more like he was being pulled. The forest, scorched and skeletal though it was, had taken on a different air since that first marking. The silence pressed in closer. Even the birds seemed to avoid the place now. He hiked deeper past the last flagged tree, his boots crunching over brittle charcoal and ash-soft ground. The air was damp, tinged with rot and something older, like wet stone. As he crossed a narrow gully, The light shifted, filtered through the few remaining green boughs of the canopy above, and landed on something half buried in the moss. It was metal. Dull, rust-ridden, edges softened by time. He bent down and brushed away the clumps of moss, revealing the skeletal frame of a camping stove. The kind you'd take on a weekend trip. Compact, portable. It didn't belong here. Not this deep, not this forgotten. He turned it over. The bottom had faint engraving, part of a brand name, unreadable now, but the shape triggered something in the back of his memory. Just beyond it, hidden under a shallow shelf of earth and roots, was something else. A bundle. He dropped to one knee, careful not to disturb more than necessary, and slowly began pulling it free. It was a backpack, or what was left of one. The outer shell had rotted, eaten by moisture and time, but the interior strangely was intact. Inside he found a rolled jacket, a granola bar wrapper, a folded nylon poncho, a pocket knife, everything untouched by mold or water, as though sealed in its own small time capsule. And then came the journal. It was tucked between two shirts, wrapped in a plastic grocery bag yellowed from age. Elias slid it out carefully. The cover was soft to the touch, faux leather peeled at the corners. A small sticker had once adorned the front, a faded cartoon spaceship now almost completely worn away. He opened it, half expecting blank pages or the usual teenage musings. But what he found didn't feel like musings. The handwriting was small, uneven, childlike, but focused. The first pages were innocent lists of birds seen, drawings of trees, stick figure sketches of a tent and a campfire. Notes about the weather, what they ate for dinner. It read like a kid trying to please someone, maybe a teacher, maybe a parent. But then, around page 30, the tone shifted. The entries grew sparse, more erratic. "We heard something last night," one line read. "Dad says it was wind, but it didn't move like wind." Another, "The trees were closer today. I swear they were farther away yesterday." There were no dates, no explanations, just scattered thoughts and strange observations. "He's watching now. We shouldn't have gone off trail. Dad says stay calm. I think he's scared." The final written words, hastily scrawled and smudged near the back of the journal, read, "He listens in the roots." Elias stood for a long time, the journal open in his hands, as the wind moved gently through the fire-blackened trees. It was colder now. The kind of cold that didn't match the temperature. The kind that came from the ground. He didn't feel alone anymore. The pages told two stories. Elias sat in his trailer that night, the journal spread open under the dim yellow of a hanging bulb. He had flipped through the pages again and again, trying to make sense of what he was seeing. But the more he read, the less it made sense, at least in any way he understood. The early entries had confirmed what he already feared. The journal belonged to the boy, Kyle Mallory. His name was signed inside the back cover in pencil, block letters written with the seriousness only a child could conjure. He wrote about his dad, about the meals they cooked, about a bird with red wings that landed on his boot and didn't fly away. He wrote that he missed his mom, that he didn't want to go home yet, but he was glad his dad smiled that morning. That maybe things were getting better. Then, the fear crept in slowly at first. Small notes that didn't fit. Trees that seemed closer in the morning than they had been at night. An owl that watched him too long. Shapes he wasn't sure were real. He described whispers, not voices exactly, but sounds like breath through hollow wood. The last entry in that child's hand ended abruptly, mid-sentence. Dad said to stay still and not make a sound, even if it, and nothing more. The pencil line trailed off into a smear, like the book had been yanked from his hand. Then there was a gap, at least 50 blank pages. And then, it resumed. The handwriting that followed wasn't Kyle's. It was tighter, more angular, like someone older or someone who had forgotten how to write and was relearning it under pressure. The ink had changed too. The first part was all pencil. The second, blue ballpoint, faint in places, as if the pen had been nearly dry. What startled Elias most wasn't the switch, but the date in the margin, March 2010. Almost 2 years after the boy had vanished. The entries from this second voice weren't narrative. They were fractured, strange. Some pages had nothing but symbols, circles within circles, lines that overlapped and bled into each other. Others contained brief sentences, poetic in a way that didn't feel human. The trees blink when I sleep. He doesn't like fire, but he loves warmth. I made a friend, but I don't know if it's me. Then came a name. I am still Kyle. Written once. Then again. Then 20 times on the same page, growing messier, more frantic. Followed by, he wants me to forget. Elias didn't know who he was, but the book seemed to. It mentioned the root voice, the watcher below, and a phrase that kept recurring in slightly altered forms. The echo that isn't yours. Some entries were like riddles. Others read like prayers or warnings. One page had only one sentence. He wears my father's voice. After that, the entries stopped again. Just silence. Ink stains. A torn corner where a page had been removed. Elias closed the journal slowly, heart pounding like a drum muffled by snow. Whatever had happened in those woods didn't end in 2008. The boy, if he had written those later entries, had been alive. Changed. But alive. Somewhere. And if that was true, then something else had been out there with him. Something patient. Something watching. Something that could wait years beneath the trees, speaking through bark and root and silence. Elias didn't sleep that night, and when the sun rose, he knew he couldn't leave. Not yet. Something was still unfinished, and the forest had not yet spoken its last word. By the time Elias reached the final pages of the journal, his hands trembled not from fear exactly, but from the slow realization that he was holding something that wasn't just a record of the past. It was a message. A breadcrumb. Or maybe a warning. The last entries had been sparse, erratic. Words bled into the page like they were trying to escape the mind that wrote them. But just when it seemed the journal had emptied itself of meaning, Elias turned the final sheet and saw it a map. Drawn in faded graphite, the lines were uneven but deliberate, as if created by someone who hadn't seen a proper map in years, but still remembered the land by heart. The drawing covered the entire back of the final page, the paper creased and soft at the corners from being turned too many times. At first glance, it seemed childish, simplistic, but the more Elias studied it, the more he realized how specific it was. There were trees, yes, dozens of them marked by simple symbols, but they weren't random. Each was labeled with a number. Elevation points, maybe. Landmarks only visible to someone who had walked the terrain with bare feet and raw instinct. In one corner, a stream was drawn, curving like a silver ribbon. That matched part of the land Elias had already worked near. The ridgeline was there, too, just sketched differently, marked by a jagged line that cut across the center. But farther in, beyond the places that made any topographic sense, the landscape changed. There were no trail names, no ranger notations, just shapes, dark ones, circles etched with tight loops, concentric like tree rings but all wrong, too close together. At the very center of it all, nestled in what the drawing suggested was a shallow basin beyond a rise, was a single red X. It wasn't pencil. It was ink, deep crimson, faded but unmistakable. Someone had found this page later, added to it. Or perhaps Kyle had found a pen when the pencil ran out, determined to mark the one place that mattered. Beneath the X, written in a tiny hand that Elias almost missed, were 5 words: where the silence stays warm. Elias stared at the map for a long time, tracing the lines with his eyes. He compared it against his own trail charts, cross-referenced the curves and angles with GPS renderings he'd used to log his timber plots. But the basin, the rise, the X, None of it existed on any ranger-issued material. It was as if this portion of the forest had never been catalogued. And yet, he knew the terrain, not from official records, but from the land itself. From the way the light changed in that part of the woods, how even on clear days, the sun struggled to break through the canopy. He had passed near this place once, 2 seasons back. The trees there were wrong. Too tall, too uniform, too quiet. The map wasn't just a clue. It was an invitation, or a last attempt to speak from inside whatever place had held the boy for so long. Elias didn't know if Kyle had drawn it while still himself, or if it had been etched under some foreign guidance. But the message was clear. Someone or something wanted to be found, or to be followed. And Elias Kearns, against every instinct of self-preservation he had left, was going to go. They entered the forest at first light, 5 of them moving in single file beneath the swaying boughs. Elias Kearns led the way, the journal tucked safely inside a waterproof pouch pressed close to his chest. Behind him were 2 survivalists, quiet, grim men who had worked missing person cases in terrain, even less forgiving than this. One was a former firefighter, the other, an ex-military tracker with scars like bark. A Forest Service investigator and a volunteer from the Sheriff's Department completed the group. Each carried supplies for 3 days. None spoke much. The air itself seemed to discourage it. The map had been scanned, digitized, analyzed. Still, it pointed to nowhere. The coordinates plotted from its crude landmarks landed them in a swath of forest without names or paths, where even ranger drones refused to fly for long. The old-timers had muttered warnings when Elias mentioned the location. No man's land, one called it. The forest's throat, said another. A place that swallowed footsteps and spat out only quiet. They moved carefully, marking trees every 100 feet, as if afraid they might simply vanish between one step and the next. By midday, the GPS units began to flicker. Coordinates froze. Maps reset to blank screens. At first, they blamed the canopy too dense, too thick with interference. But soon the compass needles began to spin. Not violently. Slowly. As though unsure of where north had gone. The forest changed as they advanced. Not visually, at first, still trees and moss, and the long hush of distance, but in tone. Birdsong ceased. Wind stopped moving the branches. Even their own breathing felt dulled, as if muffled by something unseen. One of the survivalists muttered, "We're inside it now," but wouldn't clarify what he meant. No one asked him to. The journal's map grew eerily accurate as they followed it deeper. Bent tree limbs where they should be. A crescent-shaped rock formation, a dry stream bed lined with brittle ferns. All exactly where Kyle had drawn them, down to the unnatural sharpness of their angles. And then, finally, the rise, the sudden slope upward that marked the threshold of something else. They climbed in silence, boots scraping stone and damp leaves, until they reached the ridge. Below it lay a basin swallowed in shadow. Despite the early afternoon Sunday, the temperature dropped, sudden and biting, as though the earth itself exhaled a breath long held. And there, at the basin's far edge, partially obscured by vines and centuries of root growth, was the cave. Its mouth was low, almost crouched, and sealed with a wall of stone stacked not by nature, but by hand. Moss grew in the crevices, thick and old. The stones were smooth, rounded, pulled from a river long since dried. They weren't just piled, they were arranged, as if to keep something in rather than out. The group stopped 10 feet from it. No one spoke. No one moved. There was something final about the place, like the punctuation at the end of a sentence never meant to be read aloud. Elias stepped forward first. He knelt, placing a hand on one of the stones. It was warm. The others followed, slowly. One of them pulled a pry bar from his pack. They would break the seal. They would enter. Not because they wanted to, but because the forest had let them come this far. It didn't take long for the discovery of the journal to leak beyond the county. Elias had tried to keep it quiet, but someone in the sheriff's office had mentioned it offhand to a relative, who mentioned it to a friend, who uploaded the details to a forum. Within hours, the internet had seized on it like dry tinder catching flame. The Mallory case had always simmered on the edges of true crime communities, one more unsolved disappearance in the deep woods, but now it erupted. They had a journal. They had words. They had symbols. For people hungry to believe, it was enough to build a universe. At first, the theories were almost mundane. A hermit in the woods, a predator who'd learned how to erase his tracks. But then the images of the journal pages surfaced. Grainy scans passed from hand to hand. Kyle's handwriting was dissected like scripture. Threads sprang up with thousands of comments, maps layered over satellite imagery, timelines reconstructed down to the hour. And always, at the center of it, the same phrases repeated from the boy's entries. He sees in bark, he listens in roots. The trees were closer today. The echo that isn't yours. To some, these were the ravings of a terrified child. To others, they were clues. A subsection of posters called it root voice phenomena, speculating about infrasonic frequencies hidden in old-growth forests. Another group claimed Kyle had stumbled on a secret cult operating in the Umpqua, a sect that worshipped the tree that watches and used rituals to lure the vulnerable. Someone posted an old black and white photo of a hooded figure standing in a clearing near Crater Lake in 1912. It was blurry, but it didn't matter. It became proof. Then the wilder theories began to crawl out of the digital underbrush. Threads about government black sites buried beneath the forest floor. Underground bunkers from the Cold War era, repurposed for experiments in sensory deprivation. A time loop hypothesis gained traction after a user compared Kyle's map to archival images of the area from the 1,960 seconds, claiming the topography didn't match valleys where hills had been, rivers flowing opposite directions. The boy didn't vanish, one comment read. He crossed. Crossed what? No one could say, but the speculation was intoxicating. Whole sub-communities formed around the journal's phrases. One group called themselves Bark Watchers. They uploaded videos of themselves whispering Kyle's lines into tree trunks, waiting for echoes. Another group began cataloging supposed hotspots where compasses spun and GPS failed, mapping them across the Pacific Northwest like constellations. Some swore the forest was a living entity, a network older than humanity, with a will of its own. Others claimed Kyle's entries were a cipher, a hidden code meant to guide rescuers to his location or to keep them out. What had been a tragedy became a mythology. Kyle was no longer just a boy lost in the woods. He became a vessel for everything people feared about places untouched by light and surveillance. A ghost, a prophet, a warning. Some whispered that he hadn't written the second half of the journal at all, that it was something else using his hand. He sees in bark, he listens in roots. The phrase multiplied like spores, posted on shirts, stitched into patches, scrawled on walls near hiking trails. A mantra, a dare, a talisman. And behind it all, the forest stood indifferent. The trees absorbed the rain and reached for the sun as they had for centuries, their roots tangled in darkness no camera could see. If there was something down there, if there really was a watcher in the roots, it said nothing. It only listened. The stones gave way with a groan that echoed too long, as if the cave itself had forgotten how to be disturbed. One by one, the men pulled them free, stacking them carefully to the side, not out of reverence, but caution. Even in the thinning light of the forest basin, the mouth of the cave remained cloaked in a kind of darkness that wasn't just shadow. It felt old, patient, thick with waiting. When the last stone dropped away, no breeze spilled out. No musty breath of hidden air. Just stillness. Elias went in first, flashlight trembling in his hand, though he tried to hold it steady. The beam pierced the dark in narrow slices, catching nothing at first but dust and stone. The others followed silently, ducking into the low opening, their breath tight in their throats. The walls were moist and smooth, as though worn by centuries of something moving against them. No wildlife sounds filtered in, no dripping water. It was a silence so complete it felt like pressure. 10 feet in, the tunnel widened into a chamber, hollowed out by forces that left no tool marks. It was neither natural nor fully man-made, somewhere in between. The floor sloped gently, and in its lowest point lay a scattering of objects. A tarnished thermos, the remains of a flannel shirt turned to threads, a pair of half-rotted boots, and bones. They weren't arranged in any ritualistic way. No careful display, just scattered, as if the man who left them had lain down one day and never risen. Elias crouched beside the remains, shining his light across the ribcage and spine, the long femurs lying askew. The skull was tilted sideways, its jaw partially buried in loose soil. He reached down, brushing away a layer of grit, and found a pocket knife wedged beside what had once been a belt loop. The metal was dull, but the engraving was still visible. J.M. James Mallory. Elias said nothing, only closed his hand around the knife and stood up slowly. Behind him, one of the survivalists exhaled, a quiet breath like the end of a long-held sentence. They searched the rest of the chamber with careful precision, looked for any signs of the boy. No smaller bones, no second pile of belongings, no clothing, nothing. Just that one adult skeleton, alone in the dark. At the far end of the cave, opposite the entrance, the wall narrowed into a thin slit, too narrow for an adult to pass through, but perhaps wide enough for someone smaller, a child, once. The flashlight barely reached beyond it, catching only a glimpse of rock that seemed to twist away like a throat turning inward. The air near the gap felt colder, more still, and when Elias leaned close, he thought he heard something, not a sound exactly, but the absence of one, pulsing gently like a heartbeat beneath the stone. They marked the bones, photographed the chamber, called in the ranger station through a garbled radio that only worked once they stepped back outside. The official report would be clean. A missing man found. Presumed dead from exposure, injury, or worse. The closure everyone said they wanted. But Elias knew it wasn't finished. The boy wasn't there. No remains, no belongings, no trace. Just that narrow passage, that too small space in the rock, and the quiet that hummed behind it like something alive and listening. The forest had returned one piece of the story. The rest, it seemed, it would keep. It surfaced years later, quietly, almost accidentally. A cold case technician in the Oregon State Police Archives had been digitizing old security footage for long-term storage footage collected from various small towns across the state during a multi-year sweep of unsolved disappearances. The technician, tired and half-distracted, almost skipped the file. It was marked simply, CCTV, Grants Corner Gas, March 2015. A routine night in a nowhere station. But something made him pause, maybe the date, maybe the proximity to Crater Lake. He clicked play. The footage was grainy, but clear enough. The timestamp blinked 2:14 a.m. The gas station was quiet, a single pump flickering under the canopy, fluorescent lights buzzing inside. The door opened, and in stepped a boy, thin, pale, barefoot. He didn't speak, just hovered near the entrance, eyes darting, arms crossed tightly over his chest. He wore a tattered hoodie, the sleeves ripped at the ends, and cargo pants that sagged on his frame like they'd been borrowed from someone much larger. His feet were raw. Not just dirty, scarred, blistered, swollen from cold or endless walking. He looked like he hadn't eaten in days, but his eyes were sharp, feral, tracking movement like a cornered animal. The attendant, a woman in her 40s, appeared startled. She spoke to him, gently. He didn't respond. Didn't look at her. He scanned the shelves, cans, crackers, water, and grabbed nothing. His hands never opened from their clutched fists. When another customer entered behind him, he flinched and bolted toward the back of the store, disappearing just out of the camera's view. Moments later, the rear emergency door was triggered. He was gone. The police weren't called until hours later. The attendant had chalked it up to another lost teen, maybe high, maybe scared, and by the time she mentioned it to the morning shift, the moment had passed. But the footage had remained, buried in an unremarkable case folder for over 5 years. When Elias saw the clip forwarded to him by a retired deputy who still followed the Mallory case, it stopped him cold. The eyes, the shape of the mouth, the slight dip in the left shoulder, just like in the school photo. He sent it for analysis through a private firm specializing in age progression and facial recognition. 87%. That was the match probability. Not enough to declare certainty, but far too high to ignore. They compared the clip to Kyle's last known images, age 10, smiling thinly beneath a mop of hair, his front teeth still slightly gapped. The boy in the video was older, leaner, wild with paranoia, but the lines of the face were there. The bone beneath the skin hadn't changed. Elias drove to the gas station himself. The clerk on duty remembered nothing. The security system had long since been replaced. The rear lot backed up into forest. No one saw which direction the boy had run. He left no footprints, no fingerprints, not even a single dropped thread of fabric. He had appeared, as if from nowhere, then vanished just as suddenly, like fog burning off at sunrise. But the video remained. And in it, frozen forever, was the look in that boy's eyes, not fear exactly, but knowing. A kind of resigned understanding, as if he had walked far beyond what the world recognized, and had only stepped back into it by mistake. A glimpse, a ghost. He had come up for air, and then the forest had taken him back. They didn't notice the pattern at first. In the scramble to document the cave and recover the remains, the team's focus had been fixed inward on what lay hidden in the stone belly of the earth. But as the days passed and aerial surveys were conducted, a larger picture began to emerge. From above, in high-resolution drone images, the trees around the cave did not grow in random clusters or the natural chaos of untouched wilderness. They stood in a circle, deliberate, symmetrical, unnaturally precise. Pines, 21 of them, each equidistant from the next, each one marked by the same silent disfigurement. Their bark was scorched. Not burnt through, not consumed by wildfire, but blackened in tall vertical bands running from root to branch as though a hand had passed over each trunk and pressed heat into it without flame. The pattern was the same on all of them. Thin ribbons of carbon traced up their sides like ceremonial paint. When examined more closely, the scorched sections weren't just burned, they were dead. No sap, no new growth. Yet the rest of each tree remained alive, towering and full, needles green, branches reaching toward the sky in perfect stillness. Elias stood at the center of the ring, just outside the cave entrance, and turned slowly in place. From the ground, the shape wasn't obvious. It felt like any dense patch of forest. But once he understood what to look for, the spacing, the scars, it became unmistakable. This was not a coincidence. Nature did not make circles like this, not in a forest that had grown wild for centuries. He listened. There was no wind. The trees did not sway. No birds stirred in their branches, and most disturbingly of all, no insects hummed. The silence was not peaceful, it was unnatural. Even the flies, usually quick to gather around sites of human remains, were absent. The air was sterile in a way that defied biology. Sound died here, no echo, no rustle. Just the press of stillness, thick as wool. The soil within the circle was softer, darker. When probed, it felt looser than the ground just a few feet beyond the perimeter. like something beneath had been disturbed or something had risen. One of the investigators from the Ranger Service crouched near one of the trees and peeled back a layer of scorched bark. Underneath, carved into the exposed wood, was a symbol. Elias recognized it. He had seen it in the journal, scribbled into margins and drawn again and again in growing desperation. It was the spiral, the root symbol. The trees weren't just witnesses, they were participants, markers, sentinels arranged around something meant to be watched or guarded. A ritual site perhaps, but not the kind built with stone and fire. This was older, more patient, grown into being. Whatever had happened here, whatever had claimed James Mallory and taken Kyle into the deep, had left its imprint not just in whispers or bones, but in the very structure of the forest. Later, as dusk fell, Elias walked the circle again. 21 trees, 21 scars. He tried not to think of it as a clock, as a gate, as a mouth waiting to open. But as the light dimmed and the ring darkened, he couldn't help but feel the center of the circle had shifted, and that something beneath it was listening. Three days after the team vacated the site, a second crew was dispatched to collect remaining survey equipment. They arrived in the early morning, fog still clinging low to the earth, the trees looming with their scorched vertical scars. The air, despite the daylight, carried a kind of tension, as though the forest had inhaled and hadn't yet exhaled. They moved quickly, wanting to finish before dusk. No one liked staying in the ring longer than necessary. It was a junior field assistant, no more than 20, fresh from school, who found the note. She had been checking the geological sensors left near the cave entrance, crouching near the stone wall where the air always seemed a few degrees colder. One of the rocks, partially dislodged during the original excavation, had left a narrow crevice in the cave's outer mouth. Something inside caught her eye. Paper. Crushed, yellowed, stuffed into the gap as if hidden or left. She hesitated. The paper didn't look old, not weather-worn or water-damaged like everything else they'd recovered from the site. It was intact, folded tightly, stained slightly along the crease by oil from fingers. She reached in and pulled it free. No signature, no date. Just 5 words written in shaky but unmistakably recent handwriting. "I am still not free." The team's radios buzzed moments later. Within an hour, Elias was back at the site, holding the note between gloved fingers, his face unreadable. He knew instinctively that this hadn't been there when they first found the cave. He'd searched every inch of that wall, even leaned against it more than once, and never noticed anything wedged in the stone. It wasn't just overlooked, it was new. The handwriting bore similarities to the second section of Kyle's journal, not identical, but close enough to raise a storm of questions. The uneven loops, the strange tremble in the letters, as if written in the dark or by someone not used to holding a pen. It was written in black ink, smudged slightly at the edges, as though clenched too tightly after being written, then crumpled in haste. No prints. No sign of who or what had left it. Speculation exploded. Within days, the forums caught wind of the find, and theories ignited like brushfire. Some believed Kyle was alive and had been watching the investigators from the trees, waiting for them to leave. Others insisted the note wasn't written by him at all, but by something else, something mimicking him. A warning, a plea, a trap. But Elias couldn't ignore the feeling in his gut. The simplicity of the message. The absence of metaphor. This wasn't myth or symbol. This was a voice, raw and human, speaking plainly through the narrowest crack it had been given. "I am still not free." He read the words over and over, haunted not by what they said, but by what they didn't. It didn't say where he was. It didn't say who held him. It didn't say for how long. It just spoke from the threshold caught between the forest and the world, between memory and myth. He imagined Kyle, older now, face hollowed by years of silence, crouched just beyond the reach of daylight, scribbling this single message and pushing it through the stone as the forest shifted behind him. Somewhere out there, a boy or the shadow of one was waiting. And the forest wasn't done speaking. Meredith Mallory had stopped expecting the mail to mean anything. For years, letters had come in waves, condolences, prayers, theories from strangers, wild claims from self-proclaimed psychics. She had learned to sift through it without hope. Most days, she tossed it aside without opening it, dropping envelopes into the recycling bin with the practiced hand of someone long past believing in miracles. But on a quiet Thursday morning in late autumn, as wind pressed dry leaves against the steps of her porch, a plain brown envelope arrived without a return address. There was no postage stamp, no postmark, just her name, written in careful black ink, and her street number in the corner. Someone had delivered it by hand. Inside, folded 3 times, was a single piece of paper. Meredith unfolded it slowly, cautiously, half expecting another flyer, another unspeakable prank. But what she found stopped her breath like a fist to the chest. It was Kyle's drawing. She knew it instantly. Not a copy, not a print. The paper was aged in the same way. His old notebooks had been the slight crinkle from his habit of leaning too hard with his pencil, the faint smear of eraser where he'd tried to fix one of the stick figure's arms. It was the drawing he'd made the week before the trip, sitting at the kitchen table, his legs swinging beneath the chair, tongue poking slightly from the corner of his mouth in concentration. 2 figures stood beside a tree, holding hands, one taller, with blocky shoulders, one smaller, with uneven legs. Above them, he had drawn a sun bright, too large for the page, and at the very top, a line of looping clouds that resembled something between wings and waves. She had kept the original pinned to the refrigerator for years, until it disappeared the night of the move, when she downsized and sold the house. She had believed it lost forever. But here it was again. And on the back, written in a steady adult hand that wasn't Kyle's but felt somehow familiar, was a GPS coordinate. Just numbers, nothing else, no explanation. She didn't need to trace them herself. She brought the paper to the deputy who still called every Christmas, the only one who hadn't stopped returning her messages. He entered the numbers into his system, and when the map loaded, they both stared at the screen in silence. The point marked wasn't random. It was the exact location of Elias Kearns's logging site, the one where the journal had been found, the one where the cave had been unearthed. 17 years after her son vanished, someone, something was reaching back. She didn't cry. Not then. She pressed her hand gently to the drawing, as if touching the past might steady the present. The lines were faded, but the meaning wasn't. A child's sketch of a weekend meant for healing. A family that had walked into the trees together, expecting peace. And now this echo returned to her across time, like a ripple touching the edge of a forgotten pond. She didn't know what waited at the center of it all, but she knew, in her bones, that Kyle had drawn it for her. And someone, perhaps him, perhaps someone changed by what he had become, had sent it back. Not as closure, but as a beginning. There are forests that grow like memories, slow, tangled, rooted in silence. They keep no record the way people do. No names carved in stone, no photos in dusty albums. But they remember, in their own way. In the way bark hardens over wounds, in the way branches lean toward absences rather than light. They do not forgive, they do not forget. The Umpqua forest has been many things. A home for creatures now extinct. A shelter for wanderers who never meant to stay. A quiet refuge for those trying to outrun the weight of their lives. But for the Mallorys, it became something else. A witness, a warden. A place that did not just take, it watched. James Mallory walked into the woods with a son, and the fragile hope of rebuilding what time and circumstance had broken. He never walked out. What he left behind was not only a truck and a tent and a trail gone cold, but a question so vast that it echoed for nearly 2 decades in the spaces between pine needles. Kyle Mallory became more than missing. He became myth. A name passed between investigators and online forums, a face frozen in pre-adolescence, suspended in amber grief. Some say he died in the cave, spirit broken before the body. Some say he was taken by a presence not interested in ransom or reason, but in something quieter and more complete. Others still believe he lived, changed but not undone. Learning the forest's language, one root, one whisper, one dark dream at a time. What is certain is this: something remains. It hums beneath the soil, like a heartbeat buried deep. It breathes when fog rolls low and the trees go still. It lingers in places no GPS will track, in trails that fold back into themselves like a closing hand. The map in Kyle's journal, the scorched ring of trees, the cave with the sealed mouth, none of it has answers. Only artifacts, only pieces. And sometimes, pieces speak. The note, 5 words scrawled in trembling ink, still rests in evidence storage, untouched by sunlight. I am still not free. Some believe it was a hoax. Others are sure it was Kyle. Still others wonder if it was something older, something wearing his shape, trying to find a door back to wherever it came from. Elias Kearns never returned to the logging site. He resigned his contract and disappeared into quiet, refusing all interviews. Meredith Mallory keeps the drawing folded in her purse, edges worn, as if touching it might conjure breath. The coordinates burned into her mind now, not as numbers, but as a place one she might still return to, one she might not. And the forest? It continues, grows, forgets nothing. Hikers speak of unease near that basin. Animals skirt the edges without entering. Trees lean inward. Some say it's just a story. Others say the forest remembers the boy who walked too far, the father who followed, and the silence that grew between them. In the end, there is no twist, no sudden answer, no final reveal. Only the trees, still, silent, listening.